A while ago, I made a video discussing the fears I had for the future of Pixar with this trend that has been going on for the past few years and the worries with the upcoming movie that they're releasing this year known as Elemental. And although I made it the main focus of that video, there is still something more worrisome that I'm realizing with this movie, making Pixar more generic than I thought possible. It's something that we've actually seen in Lightyear that exemplifies and showcases how basic they have become, but going this far with the most basic elements is something of far more concern. Like I said before, I appreciate the style that they're trying to do to differentiate what Pixar has been doing in the past in animation, but it just feels so wrong for a company like Pixar to be doing. It also didn't help that this movie is directed by the same person who did The Good Dinosaur, one of the weakest Pixar films that they've ever made. And that's not to say I think he's bad, I'm pretty sure he's a good guy with good ideas, but I just don't feel confident with that type of creativity driving this project forward and what we have seen so far. A lot of people have recently said that this looks like the shorts that Pixar would actually make instead of the ones that would actually air before the Pixar movie, and I actually think that is a 100% true, where the idea seems so minimal and small that they would rather fit this style instead. Like, if you look at the trailer and what they are doing in it, they don't really take the elemental idea seriously with these elements who cannot mix, which isn't even true in the slightest, because with that statement, this movie is implying that everything we know in all of life at this very moment should not exist, where fire can't exist without air, air cannot exist without water, and neither could earth. The basic knowledge that goes in with knowing elements, which goes against the entire main Romeo and Juliet message of the movie, where you have to believe me when I say I want to like this movie but can't when all of these facts are present are wrong compared to their other previous movies. And then of course there is the problem of portraying air as clouds, because clouds are literally solid particles or liquid droplets in air. It's something that says air is a completely separate thing from clouds themselves, and portraying air like this rather than something else that they could come up with shows a clear lack of understanding of what story that they are trying to tell with the elements. I mean, that fact might be nitpicky and not important to the overall message of the movie, but it just feels like something they should have spent more time digging into when the facts are simply not true to real life elements, where once again, they still make it a fact that elements cannot mix when most of them have and can mix. So yeah, despite the visual differing from most Pixar stories, it still doesn't hide the fact that it can be a boring story overall for something predominantly seen before. I mean, taking a look at the city is no different from something compared to Disney's past films and like Zootopia and Ralph Breaks the Internet, the movie where the whole internet is sort of portrayed within the same cityscape, where this movie only has like 4 of the 5 main elements, discluding of course space in that argument, which is the last one and actually provides with an interesting idea rather than having all the designs here feel so shackled by each other in ways that I couldn't have thought. Actually, funny enough, looking back on the guy who's directing this also made the Partly Cloudy short that premiered before Up, where I kind of actually get how this has been an idea brewing for a while. I mean, I like the short because I was young back then and how it relates to that, and how the style of this film really feels more like a short in itself rather than a movie, where watching it again makes me realize that yes, this movie indeed is a short film where the idea can actually work better rather than a full-length feature film. It's just become more obvious by the generic plotline that this story is better suited for that compared to the one they want us to see. I see it as another issue I had with Turning Red being by the same director who made Bao before that, being one of the best Pixar shorts that they have ever made, where I just didn't feel like Turning Red was clearly something I would like at all, based upon something I never experienced nor that I would like to, where I still don't think that is a bad film in that case, where I would actually want to explore it a little bit later on as to see why such ideas are better off showed more general audiences if they fit a certain style. They are just not taking that concept far enough here. With what most people have seen, it's just not what we want. Everything the message is going for is completely contradicted in the trailers so far, on the same bus and whatnot, where you were not taking that message to heart about elements cannot mix, which cannot make sense in the first place. And the bigger problem seems like they actually had these ideas of the elements in segregated places and separate places, but once again, as I said before, it contradicts that very message in the very trailer. I mean, you have several shots showing different neighborhoods of fire and water, but once again, you still have these bus of all people coalescing in the same exact space as each other, completely negating any message you had before that, which if you want your message to actually be strong, you shouldn't include such ideas that go against that. As a whole, this movie is representing the approach that modern Disney takes into every new piece of media, too easy and too safe and not good enough to make us love it. It's still something I hardly understand considering that this is made by a company who has a plethora of resources for every single department possible but only uses a fraction of its power to release release mediocre or terrible content to keep a well-oiled money machine going on where they could actually show us something different and unique with this very story that they present. And looking more on why this story is being created, I actually can fully understand that, where it is described that this movie is about thanking your parents and understanding their sacrifices, and director Peter Sohn's parents actually passed away during the making of this film, which really makes this more emotional for him, and something I really appreciate with what most of these directors make for these films with their hearts and passions to those close to them. But I just hope with that knowledge we can actually get into a story that they want rather than something that feels more designed by committee to continue the safe plays that they want to make rather than making something else with what we've seen so far. Like when I see the trailers, this just feels like there will be no villain again. Not that I think Pixar makes subpar stories without them like it has been in Disney's case, where with what they have shown in their case has been clearly better to do so, but I have just been missing that touch, and Lightyear is truly a poor excuse at bringing them back, where I just really need that feature in the stories. You can show us these types of stories, but you clearly lack the ones that add to the decisions that the characters make in the first place. I mean, you can derive the antagonistic elements of the story from the parents, like the typical Romeo and Juliet story, but it really doesn't seem like that is the primary case, referring back to how this movie is about understanding your parents and the decisions that they made for you to be where you are right now in your life. And this also brings us to another great comparison, because I saw this film was going to have the music by Thomas Newman, who brought us many of phenomenal Pixar soundtracks in the past, like Finding Nemo and my favorite being WALL-E. We would derive the same elements of Elemental to mostly Zootopia being that generic of an idea and landscape, where I instead want to compare it to WALL-E and what they did and why it worked. WALL-E is in fact another love story like this one, but instead took a more dystopian concepts to its world where no humans live on Earth and the only one who remains is a robot who searches for love in that very world, where eventually he finds it and goes on another adventure to bring humans back along with his newfound love. How that was an interesting story to take for a love story that has a clearly strong message that anyone of any age could get into, encapsulating this early Pixar era that involved people from different worlds coming together in new ways than what we knew of before, and how they could actually use that concept in a different way for this movie instead of being something we've already knew. The bigger picture they want to present us is something very important to tell about segregated groups of people and how that is bad and how we should just be as one with each other, but they're choosing to do something very basic in its formula that doesn't make you think like Pixar used to do. Instead of having this train full of people, you should instead commit to segregating them separately entirely in their worlds, where one of the best comments I read on this situation said that they should take the ideas of what Raya and the Last Dragon did, where of course I'm not a fan of that movie at all, but had this concept of separate people having to work together to get what they want for the city. In this case, instead of having this generic love story that is being presented to us, maybe make that kind of story of one person or element in this case having to work with each other and finding that they have more in common with each other, where it could be more like a background story to how the world was formed by the elements, the idea of how everything we know actually came to be, first separated because they never got along, and then realizing it doesn't matter who we are or what we do, because at the end of the day we are all the same no matter what color or element we are in that case, as a creation story that could really fit a strong message. And I know that probably seems generic as the plot, but I feel like exploring that would make it a whole lot better than a typical love story, which I don't need, which Disney actually does a lot more times than you actually realize, where of course the main focus of what you want to derive from this film is the means of the parental story that the director feels more inspired by. And like I said, I don't hate what I see, I just know what I see, where at the very least with this new knowledge into researching a little bit more about the world, I feel more confident that this movie will not be horrendous or bad, but just still more in the middle, where I'm just hopeful of what they can accomplish and what kind of style this story is supposed to be derived from as a whole. And I really do hope to be entertained by that story if it manages to pull itself off, despite the generic tone I have seen. Everything about it, despite what some say, looks really beautiful, and I really take it to heart, where no matter what happens, this is still something that Disney still needs as a whole to make different stories, especially for Pixar, who shines at their best without Disney influence dragging them down as a whole. And if they can do that with this very story, then I will be forever grateful for them to go back and enter dangerous waters, where one day Disney themselves can actually realize that to what they need to make their story shine the most, in the heart of why we love them to begin with. And with that said, I'm all done, so goodbye.